So, Brazilian Grand Prix, huge shock. Verstappen eliminated in Q1. Certainly not something that happens often at all. And I wanted to have a look, analyze their onboards and their data to see why that might have been the case. So let's have a look firstly at this sort of turn 1, 2, 3 sequence. Now, one thing I noticed here, which is actually similar to when I did an analysis for the Mexican Grand Prix qualifying, is that one thing Norris does really, really well is when there is a sequence of corners, he dials it back a tiny bit for the first part of the sequence, which then keeps the car in an optimal position for the rest of the sequence. And what I mean by that is we can see this is a really small difference here, but sort of around here in the very late stage of turn 1, just before you get into the apex, he slowed the car down just a tiny bit more. And you'll see when I go through the onboard, tiny bit easier on the second phase of the entry. Hooks the apex nicely, stays to the left, keeps the car in a much better position for turn 2 and then turn 3. Whereas Verstappen is slightly quicker on the late phase of the entry, misses the apex slightly, and because he missed the apex slightly, his minimum speed through turn 1 is a lot lower, because when you've missed the apex, you can't get back on throttle. You have to wait for the car to finish rotating, especially when there's a sequence of corners. Because it's not like a normal corner where if you miss the apex by a little bit, you can just let the car wash out a bit wider on exit. No, you have to, if you've missed the apex by a little bit, you then have to pull the car back, which means you have to go slower, pull the car back to then continue the sequence of corners. So have a look. So Lando does this really nice, hits the apex, and generally has a quite clean line through this turn 1, 2, 3. See, nice on the apex, well prepared for turn 2, which maximizes his run through turn 2, turn 3 down the straight. Whereas if you compare that to Verstappen, he misses the first apex a little bit and then has to wait for the car to rotate to bring it back to enter turn 2 properly. See, a little bit wide of the apex, can't get on the throttle as early, then has a tighter line through turn 2. So that's, again, it comes back to the same concept. Like the same thing we saw Lando doing at Mexico through the high-speed S's is dialing it back at the start of a sequence to prioritize the rest of it. And overall, this ends up being a 10th and a half just through this sequence. Now let's have a look at turn 4. This one's really interesting because there is actually a huge difference between the way they each approach this corner. What I've done is I've lined these videos up with where they're braking. So Verstappen is braking around about the 100 board. Lando is braking at least 10 meters earlier, right? At least 10 meters earlier. I mean, if we look at the data here, where's Norris is braking at 16 meters, according to this. So yeah, call it about 15 meters. And so Norris is relatively gentle in, has a super strong exit. This, when you look at the apex, and if you listen to the audio, listen to where each applies the throttle as well. Because Lando is braking 15 meters earlier, but is on the throttle, say 10 meters earlier. It's this trade-off between sacrificing your entry for a strong exit. Typical thing you hear people say all the time, slow in, fast out. There's not, in the end, this is a difference of half a tenth in Lando's favor, just because the exit is so strong. And I think this really hammers home the point of there's no need to over push corner entries, because you can see Lando here really not pushing the entry at all, but gains all of that time plus some on exit. If you do undercook the entry of a corner at any point, you will generally gain at least most of that back on the exit because you can apply the throttle earlier. Whereas if you over push the entry and you go in too quick, getting on the throttle later doesn't work in the same way. You generally lose more than the time you've gained by over pushing the entry, because when you over push the entry and you go into the corner too fast, you actually miss rotation and you just have to wait for the car to slow down a bit. Whereas when you back off a little bit on the entry, at least you're then in control of when you apply the throttle and how you exit the corner. So that's why if you imagine, right, if you've got perfect corner entry here, you've got going easy on the entry, and you've got over pushing the entry, anything sort of down here within reason is still roughly the same delta overall. You won't lose time. But anything above that mark, you do lose time. And so it's one of these things about understanding where your margin for error is at each phase of the corner. And for the majority of corners, that margin for error is you're better off undercooking it than overcooking. So have a look. So I'll back this up a little bit. So listen to where Lando brakes and listen to where he applies the throttle. See, so Lando's applying the throttle before the start of that yellow curb on the apex, whereas compare that to Max, he brakes at the 100 and is on the throttle much later as well. He's on the throttle about 10 meters later. And again, it's a trade-off. It's half a tenth for Lando. So, you could argue that Verstappen has overpushed the entry a tiny bit here, because at the end of the day, Lando's super strong exit by coming back was beneficial. So now coming into turns 6 and 7, the high-speed corner going up around the hill. Again, we see sort of a different approach between these two drivers. In terms of the net time game, it's exactly the same, but it is two different approaches. So what Lando does here is slows the car a little bit more into the mid corner, but is then much quicker to get back on throttle. And you can see this here. Carries a bit more speed in, slows the car up a little bit on apex. I mean, slows up. This is relative. This is still like 220 kilometers an hour. And then accelerates out of it. So it's a bit more of a V style approach, whereas Verstappen comes in a little bit slower, but then carries that speed in, doesn't slow it down as much in the mid corner. And again, this is highlighting two different approaches for this type of high speed corner, or sort of medium to high speed corner. Is you've got the V-shaped line like Lando's doing, and more of a U-shaped line like Verstappen's doing. The U-shaped line tends to help when you need to keep the platform stable, because it helps keep the platform more stable, because the less pitching you're doing, like anytime you're slowing down or speeding up, the car is pitching a bit. So if it's a situation where you just want to keep the car as stable as possible, then this sort of U-shape approach tends to work. Plus, it means you're sort of on the throttle a little bit earlier, just like leaning on the throttle. And you actually hear it when we look at Verstappen's audio. You'll hear, like, when he gets to the mid corner, he sort of like he's leaning on the throttle a bit, keeping the car stable. Whereas Lando is, depending, like, he's got a different car balance or has more confidence in the car, I don't know, but carries more speed in. Car pitches a little bit more, and this is very small amounts of pitch, right? Because it's not huge deceleration, but it is a difference. So yeah, have a look at Norris on board. You'll see he comes in, and then it's a very gradual, like it's a very linear throttle application for this V style approach. See how you can hear the revs increasing progressively? Whereas if we look at Verstappen, if you watch the same thing, sort of there's a little bit of variance on the throttle as he's leaning on it to keep the car stable. That sounds a bit different. But overall, it's two different approaches, but the net difference is they're equal in terms of lap time. Now we're looking at turns 8 and 9. Now, the reason I've paused the onboards where I have is I think there's an important point here. So I think this car, in Verstappen's vision, if you look at the line of where that car is and where Verstappen's looking, that's right on his line of vision towards the apex. So I reckon this car has got in the way of Verstappen's vision to the apex and has actually affected his turn in. The reason I say that is you can see that Verstappen turns in and then corrects and then sort of unwinds the steering a bit because he's realized he's turned in a bit too early. And I think this is why. I don't think Max Verstappen would just turn in too early for a corner. I think that's a pretty fundamental mistake. He's obviously, this guy is world champion. He's obviously not going to do that. But I think this car is in the way. He can't see the apex. This is not a corner where you have anything that you can really use as a turn-in reference. And so, if you're turning in even 1 meter too early, which is certainly possible when you have this in your way. I'm not saying this is a distraction. I'm saying this is an obstacle. Like you can't make this car invisible. I think that's the case, and we'll have a look at that. And then there's another interesting point coming through turn 9 as well, but I'll get to that in a second. So just watch we'll watch Norris first. Norris turns in very progressive, right, and just sort of commits to a turn in, gets through the apex, and is fine. So have a look. Their steering is nice and progressively applied. Whereas watch Verstappen, he starts to turn in, then unwinds the steering. This isn't instability. The car is not moving. This is this is a case of turning in too early and having to correct for it. Have a look. See that there? That little movement on the steering wheel, on the entry. There. That's not, the car is not moving. The car is not over rotating at all. That is correcting for turning in too early. And I think the fact that car in the way is why. Look again. That's my theory there. The other thing, if it's not that, the other thing it could be is Verstappen's broke too early. You can see this is a huge difference on entry. And when you brake too early, your timing is a bit off. If you're used to hitting the brakes and then turning in, and you've built that muscle memory up for a corner, if you brake too early, then you're naturally going to start to turn in too early as well, because, like I said, the timing's off. It could be one of two things. I think he certainly turned in too early, and it's either because there's an obstacle in the way, which I think is the case, or if not, it's a timing issue with braking too early. Now, if we look at turn 9, again, I think this is something that Lando does really well, is sacrificing a bit of entry speed. You know, same as we talked about for the sequence of corners, sacrificing a bit of entry speed to maximize exit speed. Lando is slower on the entry, blows the car up, hits his apex, or like his speed apex, a bit earlier. And by speed apex, I mean where the minimum point is in your speed, which is sometimes different from your sort of corner apex. Whereas Verstappen comes in a bit too hard, and you'll see he picks up understeer in the mid-corner. He picks up understeer, which is why he's so late to get on throttle and has such a slow exit. You know, this exit alone costs him, wow, like more than 1/10, almost 1/10 and a half, just on this exit. And then you combine that with this sort of early braking, turn in early mishaps through this sequence of corners. This is an incredible 2.5 tenths, slightly more than 2.5 tenths in these two corners, which is a huge difference. So again, like I said, watch Lando through here. It's nice and hooked up. Hits the apex early, gets on throttle early, has a good exit. Yeah, that really quite smooth. Whereas watch Verstappen, he picks up, look by just carrying, and this is not a huge difference in speed here. Yeah, this is maybe 3, 4, 5 kilometers an hour, right? But that slight overspeed means the car's not rotated by the time it gets to mid corner, and then it starts to push. He picks up a lot of mid corner understeer as a result. Have a look. See, he's just holding the wheel. The car is not turning. That's the difference there, and that's a huge difference. Like I said, through this sequence, it's 2.5 tenths. So for turns 10 and 11, I'll be honest, there's not a huge amount to analyze, other than the fact that we're seeing this difference, which is almost a bit of a role reversal between Norris and Verstappen compared to the rest of the lap, where Verstappen this time is the one easier on entry and quicker on the throttle. Unfortunately, in this case, it's net zero. There's no time difference between the two of them overall through turns 10 and 11. But it's just, this is a case of Verstappen is a bit more precise on the apex for this corner, which allows him to get on the throttle early. He has a much stronger exit. I think at the end of the day, the way Verstappen does this corner is better. Like I said, it's more precise, but it's just the way it's worked out for this corner. The net time gain is actually zero. Have a look through. Verstappen through here is nice and clean. It's the apex. On throttle nice and early. Really clean corner, and then down through turn 11, which I'm sure is easy flat. And if you watch Norris through here, you'll see he picks up a little bit of understeer just as he's getting towards the apex, which is what causes him to miss it slightly. And I'm talking like really small amount, maybe 10, 20 centimeters. But you know, this is Formula One. These are the things that make a big difference, is these tiny margins. Have a look. So it's very like he's not that far off the apex. It's just that tiny bit of mid corner understeer that he picks up, which affects his minimum corner speed and his exit speed. But like I said, at the end of the day, they're pretty much equal lap time through these two corners. Now coming up to final corner, again another huge difference. It's 0.2. Yeah, Norris is 0.2 faster than Verstappen in one corner. And all of that time comes from how quickly or how early Norris is on the throttle, which gives him, look at this exit, yeah? From the entry, it's basically no time gained. But as soon as we get to this point here, where he's applying the throttle, this is where the 0.2 comes from. The reason for that is, now, I don't know if this is, I'm assuming there's a difference in the way these two cars handle through this corner. I'm sure there is. But Norris just hooks up for him coming into the apex. It hooks up really well. It just, the car looks sharp from corner entry to apex. Whereas Verstappen's car sort of, he starts to, it doesn't seem like it rotates quite as well initially, and then it just starts to fall into mid-corner understeer, which again affects has a huge effect on where he's able to apply the throttle. It kills his minimum speed, it kills his exit. And so I think it's one of these things where I think this is a difference in the way the cars handle through this corner, because I look at where they brake at the same point, they turn in at the same point, the line is the same. The only difference is Norris' car hooks up so much better from the entry to the apex compared to Verstappen's. Have a look. I honestly, I've been looking at this for ages, and I can't see any sort of driving technique difference. It just looks like the way the car handles is fundamentally different. There, so it hooks up really well. It looks really nice. Compare that to Verstappen. The braking, the turning, everything's the same. It just the front axle falls away coming into the apex. See there, just that last bit of rotation is missing, and that kills the exit. I can't say there's a driving technique difference here because I don't see it. Like I said, I've looked at this maybe a dozen times, looking at where they brake, where they turn in, and I can't see anything. I think it's just the way these two cars handle is massively different, and maybe this is the strength of the McLaren is that they don't, in this sort of situation, whatever these conditions are, the front axle hooks a lot better. It could be a tire temperature thing at the end of the lap. I don't know. But yeah, this is not anything to do with driving technique. This is a difference in cars. This is a difference in cars through this corner, and this is worth 0.2. And you could say that for a couple of the other corners as well. Where Verstappen picks up some mid corner understeer, but for the other corners there was a difference in driving technique that you could put it down to. But not here. Not here. The braking is pretty much identical. Like I said, the turn-in was identical, just that the Verstappen's car just doesn't hook up on the apex as well. So I think what the difference is here between Norris and Verstappen, the reason Norris was P1, Verstappen was P16, was I think on the driving side, Norris is much, much better at understanding how and when to sacrifice the entry of corners. And I'm talking on a super elite level here, right? There are a couple corners where it looks like Verstappen has overpushed the entry. There's a corner like that where it looks like there's a difference in car. I think it's a combination of the two things that have caused this 0.7 deficit difference between the driver who qualified on pole and the driver who was eliminated in Q1 for first time in a very long time. I think honestly that's my read on it all. If you got any questions, let me know. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this.